His son forbade his father from attending the wedding, then sent a $80,000 invoice straight to him. Money wasn't the only thing he received. It was also a stab to the heart. He didn't pay, nor did he break anything. He simply laid two white flowers on his wife's grave, hid a key under the orchid pot, and each night quietly fixed the broken things in the house. On a rainy night, the invoice turned to ash. A week later, an unnamed parcel came back. Then the orchid put out a new shoot. Is that the gentlest kind of revenge? Early morning, when the sky was still suspended halfway between blue and ash, Walter turned on the kitchen light. Soft yellow poured over the scratched wooden table, revealing the tracks of time like veins on an old hand. He set each familiar item in its place: a faded beige placemat, a matte glazed porcelain plate, an empty white porcelain cup turned with its mouth toward the window, and in the center a sheet of cream cardstock he had cut himself last night. The edge of the card was slightly uneven, the paper's rim still speckled with scissor dust. He opened a drawer, took out a fountain pen with a worn cap, and lightly dipped the nib into the drop of black ink that remained. Before writing, he tested the pen on a scrap of paper, drew a short line, then stopped. Inhaling, he set the pen to the card and slowly wrote, word by word, "Congratulations, Kevin. I'll be rooting for you from here." The handwriting slanted slightly to the right, slender, shaky in places, decisive in others, like someone who has just come through a long stretch of road and still tries to keep his back straight. Walter blew the ink dry, unhurried. The kettle began its faint ticking on the stove behind him. He put the pen back into its groove in the wood, folded the card, ran a finger along the crease to smooth it, then tied a slender brown jute string around it. No ribbon, no pre-printed floral card, no perfume, only the smell of dry paper, old wood, and a trace of metal from the fountain pen he had just put away. He set the card in the middle of the table as if placing something fragile. Beside it, a glass vase held three fresh white daisies, the last three he had kept from the bouquet he bought a few days ago. Moisture on the window beaded into tiny dots. A few droplets slipped down, leaving long tracks like ruled lines. Beyond the glass lay a quiet alley wet with mist, where the wheels of the late garbage cart usually rolled by every Monday morning. Walter poured boiling water into the coffee filter. The smell of hot coffee rose, slow and warm, spreading through the kitchen like a thin blanket. He didn't look at the wall clock because its hands had long since stopped. He counted the minutes by the drip of coffee, by rubbing his palms together to ease the cold. When the cup was half full, he stopped, set the filter aside, and took a small sip. The familiar bitterness brushed the tip of his tongue, waking a sparse, slender warmth lying somewhere in his chest. For a moment, he looked around the kitchen. The empty hooks because no one needed another apron, the second drawer with a stuck hinge that had to be pulled slowly, the hand towel hanging askew. Everything was ordinary, intact, and a little superfluous. On the windowsill, the old orchid stood still, its thin leaves holding each other as if keeping back something not yet said. Walter touched the edge of a leaf with his finger and felt its coolness. He hadn't watered it. The morning was damp, the soil still wet enough to wait a little longer. He returned to the card, leaned in, and aligned it with the wood grain. A brown envelope lay ready. Walter took a stamp he'd bought for a parcel the previous winter, stuck it on neatly, and smoothed the edges to make it hold. In the corner of the table sat a small box of odds and ends pins, rubber bands, a shirt button that had fallen off at some point. He opened it, took out a white label, and wrote the address. He did not write a sender's name, only a recipient, only a street line. The rest he left blank, the way you leave a door unlocked. No invitation, no ticket, no request to be present. But his hand still rested on the edge of the envelope, holding there for a long moment. What he wanted to send this morning was not money, nor an explanation. It was a trace small, visible if someone cared to look, easy to pass over if someone wanted to skim past. A blessing standing at the edge, not pushing into the crowd, yet not fading. The light outside the window shifted, less blue now, tipping toward pale gold. Sparrows called to one another under the eaves. Walter lowered his hand, pulled the chair in, and sat down, setting the envelope before him like an old photograph. He tilted his head to listen to the house's smallest sounds, the creak of the wood floor, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the water in the kettle cooling by degrees. Day after day, those sounds had become the only silent language that remained faithful. He lifted the cup and took another sip. On the tabletop, moisture from the cup's base left a faint ring. He slid a coaster underneath, wiped the circle dry with a cloth. Everything returned to its place, like a habit folded neatly away. From the window, a thin shaft of sun touched the envelope and made it glow, just barely. Walter stood, carried the envelope to the door, and set it on the shoe rack, the place where he always left things he needed to take when going out. He was in no hurry. In a little while, when the post office opened, he would walk over. For now, he went back to the table, gathered the cloth, pushed in the chair, and turned off the stove. Nothing too big had just happened, and nothing smaller needed to be named. In the quiet, the initial thought, thin as a thread, had been tied into a small knot. Today, he would send off a blessing, not to be forgiven, not to be remembered with gratitude, not to trade for any seat at a party, only so that his son somewhere among people and flowers would receive a sign from someone who once was present. And that was enough for the morning. On the table, next to the card whose ink had just dried, lay a sheet printed from an email, white paper, thick, its edges still warm with the smell of the printer. The numbers stood in a column like a row of cold ceramic tiles. Food, music, venue, photography. Total $80,000. At the bottom, a small bold line, without feeling, payment due upon receipt. Walter did not get angry. Anger had a place to flare. But this morning, the kitchen held only the smell of coffee and the yellow of the light. What surfaced in him instead was a familiar weariness, the kind that makes no noise, quietly seeping into the wooden floor like rain slipping through an old eave. He drew the paper closer and read slowly, like someone checking the heartbeat of something fragile. Then, with two fingers, he folded it along an imaginary line and smoothed it lightly to make it flat. The sheet with its grand numbers shrank into a neat rectangle, not to hide it, not to display it, only so it would take up less of his kitchen. Beneath the stack of papers, he found an old postcard. The picture on the front had faded. On the back was a child's thick, wobbly hand. "Love you, Dad." A small streak of blue ink had bled at the top left corner, perhaps from a wet hand or some rainy day. Walter touched the line, placed the tip of his finger right on the word "you," and held it there for a few seconds as if testing whether that feeling was still alive. A beat in his throat caught. The disparity between the two papers lowered the kitchen by another notch of silence, one of demand, one of longing. Between them lay dozens of birthdays and dinners missing a jacket hung over the back of a chair. Walter set the postcard atop the folded invoice, not to compare them, but so the two could touch politely, like people of old passing and offering a slight greeting. He pulled open the small side drawer by the wall, took a paper clip, and clipped the bill into a thin file folder. Not thrown into the trash, not shoved into a dark corner. He gave it a decent standing place, like putting a chipped porcelain cup to the side, unused, yet not hurriedly thrown away. Walter touched his breast pocket where the checkbook still lay. He drew it out, opened the cover, and saw blank fields lined up waiting for words. The pen was already in the slot at the spine. He set it down, letting the open page flutter in the light breeze from the window. A dry maple leaf pressed in the last page quivered. He closed the book. Now was not the time, and perhaps it never would be. He went to the sink, rolled up his sleeves, and turned the water to a thin stream. The water ran steady, clear. He wrung out the hand towel and hung it back neatly. Simple motions that keep a person steady through a morning crowded with numbers. On the shelf, the white daisy vase tilted its head. Walter turned the mouth of the vase a little so the stem wouldn't rest against the side. Small tasks may not fix big things, but they restore order to a small corner that belongs to oneself. He returned to the table and placed the postcard beside the card he had just written. 2 sheets, 2 times, 2 voices. From that distance, a small decision formed in him. Clear as the drop of a pin, he would not pay, not because he could not, but because paying would turn the last thin thread into an invoice line, and then there would be nothing left to hold. But he would not break things either. There was no need to prove anything with rage. Walter pulled out a chair and sat, laying his palms on the table's edge to keep the warmth in. He looked at the postcard, and saw a narrow path open between them to do something simple, yet enough. A way of being present without buying, without interrogating. A light gesture, left there. Whoever wished to pick it up could pick it up. Whoever wished to pass could let the wind carry it away. He put the checkbook back into the drawer and pushed it gently until he heard a soft click. The folder holding the invoice was aligned with the edge of the table. On top, the Love You Dad postcard lay still like a thin charm. He poured a little more hot water into his cup. The scent of chrysanthemum tea opened, soft as breath. Outside the window, the mist had gone pale. A newspaper delivery car went by, leaving a wet track on the road. In the kitchen, the things that needed deciding had taken their places. Walter stood, lifted the card, tested its weight in his handlight as a nod. The decision had taken shape. No money, no noise. Only a trace warm enough that no one could say he had disappeared. And if that feeling still remained, it would know the way to come on its own. Walter's brown brick house sat at a corner of a street no longer young, between an abandoned railway track and an auto repair shop that had pulled down its rolling door since last winter. The old sign hung askew, its paint flaking in jagged patches, a few sparrows lining the gaps in the wood with straw. In the morning, wind slid through the rusty iron fence and made a very faint drone, like an old ventilator for the neighborhood. If you stood on the porch, you could hear an empty can rolling in the alley, the late garbage truck juddering along, and now and then the slap of a mailbox lid dropping shut at someone's house. Inside, the things were few and familiar. A wooden table with scratches running lengthwise like veins on an old hand, a blue upholstered armchair faded with time, a desk lamp with soft yellow light, a low bookcase set against the wall. The wall clock's hands had long since stopped. Walter still left it on its nail, as someone preserves a habit rather than a clock. Each day, at the instance of morning and afternoon, when the hour and minute hands happened to overlap, he glanced up. Not to check the time, but to know that some things at rest could still meet on a right beat. His mornings followed a simple order. Boil water, rinse the filter, pour in the coffee, wait for the first heavy drop to fall, wipe the tabletop with a frayed cloth, crack the window so a draft of cool air could slip in. On the sill, the orchid Elena had planted in 1998 still stood there, its glazed ceramic pot chipped at one corner, sparse leaves, slender stem, roots hugging the rim of the pot. Walter misted the leaves, lightly wiped the dust with a soft cloth, touched the soil to see if it was still moist. Sometimes he turned the pot a few inches so it could catch the sun slanting through the blinds. The second kitchen drawer stuck a little and had to be pulled slowly. Inside were things other people usually throw away. Bread ties twisted neatly, a few rubber bands gathered from the morning paper, a shirt button that had fallen off at some point. Walter arranged them in a small tin box and closed the lid with a soft click. That sound steadied the kitchen by half a step. The refrigerator hummed softly like a ship's engine offshore. He stuck a note on the fridge door. Salt, detergent, potting soil. Below it, at the corner, pencil marks indicated the days to water the orchid. The living room opened onto a small wood-planked porch. The door hinge squeaked very faintly. Once a week, Walter put on a few drops of oil and wiped the excess with a hand towel. On the wall, the old wedding photo of him and Elena sat in a pressed wood frame, set off from the wall by about the thickness of a fingernail. There wasn't much room for dust to cling. Next to the frame was a narrow shelf displaying porcelain cups, the one with a cracked rim reassigned as a pen holder. There was nothing superfluous, but it wasn't minimalist either. Everything felt kept so the room would carry a human presence. At noon, sunlight swept across the floor, striping it with broken bars of light cast by the curtains. Walter rarely turned on the TV. The sounds in the house were the creak of wood underfoot, the clink of a spoon on a glass, the rustle of a newspaper page turned in slightly damp air. He had a habit of folding the paper by column, keeping the rubber band, then going out to the porch to watch the alley. If an old tennis ball rolled over from the neighbor's yard, he picked it up and set it on the edge of the fence. There are tasks no one asks for, but once done, the step feels flatter. The backyard was narrow, with a meager strip of grass that lived frugally all year. An old lawnmower stood propped against the wall, its blade dull. Each season, Walter took the blade off and sharpened it with a small whetstone, not because the grass urgently needed cutting, but because the even rhythm of sharpening let the evening settle. The faucet dripped by drops. He wrapped more tape around the threads, stopping when the last drop fell a beat later. In the hallway, a heavy coat hung on the second hook from the outside. Right below it was a pair of boots repainted brown. On the shoe rack, there was a gap the place where someone else's pair had once sat. Walter did not fill that gap with something new. He laid a dry rag there and, from time to time, refolded it to straighten the edge, a habit of keeping an empty space clean. Every afternoon, Walter walked along the old tracks to the post office. The rails were mottled with moss. Weeds grew between them. Now and then a crushed bottle flashed under the slanting sun. He picked up a few small bits of trash and dropped them in the public bin by the oak. At the post office, he chose stamps with the national emblem or seasonal flowers not for collecting, but because an envelope has more weight when there is something beautiful at its corner. On the way back, he turned into the little corner grocery to buy a bottle of milk, a tub of detergent, a bag of salt, and sometimes a bouquet of white daisies if any remained. Come evening, the warm light inside the house gathered at the window and spilled a thin strip onto the porch. Walter sat at the table and opened a soft-backed notebook, the one where he wrote down small things. Hinge less squeaky. Orchid turned to south. Rain at 4:10. His script was even, sparse, each line with a breath of space between. Sometimes, at the paper's edge, there was a small plus sign marking the day to wash the table placemat. He did not write anyone's phone numbers. There were no appointments. The lines were a way to listen back to the house's rhythm. Late at night, he went through each room, his hand brushing the switches, turning off the lights as if closing one fold after another. On the porch, the yellow bulb was left at just enough, lighting the step. Walter looked for a moment at the empty yard and smelled the night, the scent of cooled earth, rusty iron, fading daisies. He closed the door. The wooden latch fell into its groove with a small thud. In the bedroom, the ceiling fan turned slowly, making a thin layer of breeze. On the chair, Elena's wool cardigan still hung, not to be worn, but so the room would keep the outline of a person. No one knocked, no voice called his name from distant strings of numbers. But each day, the house still opened for Walter into a chain of fitting motions: brew, wipe, turn, smooth, fold, hang, water, note. They demanded no answers and asked no questions. And it was precisely that repetition that kept him steady through months as their names changed, as if there, between the old tracks and the shuttered repair shop, there remained a small point of light that asked no one to notice it, yet, if you looked closely, it was still burning. In the wedding emails sent to those deemed truly necessary, there was a photo with a smooth, ad-like sheen. Kevin wore a fitted black tuxedo, narrow satin lapels, the bow tie tied just so, as if by a ruler. Beside him, his bride-to-be in a white gown with a train that swept lightly across the tile floor, holding a bouquet of white orchids with thick, glossy petals. Behind them rose a whole tier built from wooden frames, upon which sat pots of imported orchids, purple, white, blush, each pot tagged with a small label bearing its Latin name. Edison-style string lights cast a warm, expensive backdrop. Below, neat type, imported orchids, $200. A line of information with no excess feeling. The wedding website they shared had a sleek sliding menu: story, venue, travel, registry, RSVP. Under registry, the list appeared like a shop with baskets already set out. A semi-automatic espresso machine, a set of polished copper pots, a cast iron skillet with a wood-wrapped handle, sand-colored linen sheets, a two-night resort voucher. Beside each item was a box marked purchased or reserved. Occasionally, an entry showed thanks Aunt L with a pale heart icon. The meticulousness spread across the site as if every corner of life had been given a fresh coat of paint. In the rental house in a newly built suburb, the walls were painted cream, the baseboards white, the engineered wood floor unblemished, sunlight slipping through Roman shades folded in crisp pleats. On the kitchen island, a pink grapefruit scented candle stood in a frosted glass. Next to it lay the florist's catalog. Heavy stock, the cover corner stapled. Two sheets were stuck to the stainless steel fridge, a wedding schedule with milestones, rehearsal, decor, photos, ceremony, and a cost sheet printed with the columns deposit, balance, due date. A highlighter struck through each line. The rows stretched out like a road already drawn. The backyard was spread with thick, fine, artificial turf. Opaque string lights hung from two freshly painted wooden posts, a walnut-colored picnic table set in the middle, and on it a glass jar holding stems of silver dollar eucalyptus. On rainless evenings, they set out a cheese plate and poured rosé from a bottle resting in a small ice bucket. The images appeared regularly on social media. A slice of cheese cut to fit the hand, the tablecloth's edge flipping into a neat fold, the clink of glasses captured in a short video with gentle background music. Everything was just bright enough to be kept. In the bedroom, Kevin's tuxedo hung on a wooden hanger, the white shirt pressed flat, the buttons aligned in a straight row like a ruler's edge. On a low table, a silver cufflink box sat open. Inside, the black velvet lining held not a speck of dust. Newly polished leather shoes lay beside doubled black socks, the soles turned outward, the habit of someone who had learned to stage everything for a photograph. The smell of new leather and grapefruit essential oil mingled clean, light, and a little unfamiliar. The living room had no stray books or towels slung over chairbacks. Wall-mounted shelves displayed white-rimmed frames. The couple by the sea, the two of them with friends in beige tones standing in front of the house, a brunch shot with poached eggs and basil leaves. On a separate shelf, a small photo of Kevin as a child on a ball field, grinning with baby teeth. The frame was new, the glass clear, dustless. The photo stood there like a curated decorative detail, just enough to say memory has a place, but not too much space. A laptop rested on a particle board desk, the screen open to a spreadsheet. Tabs read, florist, catering, music, venue, photographer. The round cursor blinked in the cell. Final head count. In the screen's corner, the email icon lit up with a new notification. The inbox showed an unread message from the planning company. Subject line, timeline confirmation. The body was numbered by the minute, from the start time for makeup to the moment paper lanterns would be released to the ceiling of the hall. At the bottom, the sign-off, with love, Victoria and Kevin. A joint signature set up in the settings, so all communications carried a single voice. On the table by the door lay a stack of thank you cards pre-printed with "Thank you for celebrating with us." Textured paper, raised type, each one clipped to a small photo from the engagement. A gold ink pen lay diagonally across the stack, its cap pointing to the right hand. A box of postcards, stamps already affixed, sat below like boats waiting to leave the harbor after the wedding. The position of every object seemed balanced by eye, distance, angle, brightness, nothing superfluous, nothing old. Amid all the busy work, the imported orchid garden was the focal point of the space. In the afternoon, they changed the water in the vases, cut the stems on a slant under the tap, and wiped each droplet clinging to the petals with soft tissue. A garden shear with curved tips lay beside a misting bottle. Fallen petals were picked up at once and dropped into a lidded bin, leaving no stains on the tile floor. The orchid's faint sweetness mingled with the candle's scent, laid over the house a thin film of something worth remembering is happening. In a more tucked-away corner, a box of spare string lights, cloth tape, safety pins, a small first aid kit, electrolyte tablets, those just-in-case items, were arranged in a lidded wicker basket labeled Day of Kit. On top, a linen-covered notebook embossed in gold ink with our day. The first page read, "All the moments we planned for." The words lay there, needing no one to read them aloud, and still thickened the air a notch. In the evening, from the balcony, the newly built neighborhood lit up in horizontal bands. Music drifted over from next door like a thin strip of fabric. On the dining table, an arugula salad sprinkled with pine nuts, a gray porcelain bowl of dressing. Tall-stemmed glasses stood in a row, reflecting the string of lights beyond the glass doors. A napkin, folded into a triangle, placed so its edge pointed toward the chair to be occupied. Small motions, rehearsals for a day already set. The photo in the email, the cost line, imported orchids, $3,200, the sleek wedding website, the bright, airy frames, all created a smooth world where anything old was kept out of the shot. There, Kevin moved neatly among flowers, glass, and unerring timeline entries, like someone who had learned very quickly how to live inside carefully composed pictures. What remained outside the frame stood quietly at the margins, making no sound. In that warm light, everything seemed to fit, at least on the surface. Sitting before the low wooden cabinet flush against the wall, Walter pulled out the bottom drawer. The metal pull was cold. The wooden body caught slightly, then released a scent of old paper mixed with the faint damp under the floorboards. He skimmed past brown envelopes, a coil of jute twine, Elena's ring box, and touched a flat blue tin with paint chipped at the corner. The lid bore a fingertip-sized dent, the mark of many openings and closings. He lifted the tin onto his lap and heard the hinge rasp softly, like bones creaking on a day of changing weather. Inside were small family photographs with white borders. Some had curled edges. On one, a speck of dust clung fine as sea salt. He braced his thumb at the edge, inhaled, and began to flip. A birthday cake with 3 candles tilted away from one another, Elena smiling with a dimple in her left cheek. A Halloween where Kevin wore an oversized cowboy hat, the strap loose beneath his chin. A gray-sheened beach. A young father holding a child not yet long enough for his feet to touch the ground. Each photo was like a shard fallen from a broken vase, edges sharp, yet the surface still keeping its warm grain. He found the one he needed not by intent, but because red rose at once from among the colors gone to yellow. Kevin at 5 in a red cap, eyes squinting in the sun, both arms cinched around his father's neck. The father bent forward, piggybacking the child, stepping over a park lawn spattered with light. The small arm dug into the collar of a shirt, leaving a creased ridge, the very crease he would later see in work blue shirts, though the seasons had changed. Behind them, a row of trees shedding leaves at the edge of autumn. In the corner of the photo, a blur of someone carrying a thermos. A hazy detail, yet enough to conjure the smell of warm steel and the click of a cap twisting open. Walter held the photo between 2 fingers and let it lie flat on his other palm. The white border had deepened to cream. A fine scratch ran along the brim of the red cap like a strand of gray hair. He said nothing. He simply set his fingertip on the corner of the photo, as if to pin time and place there. The feeling, paper thin as he expected, pricked instead, running from finger to wrist and slipping into his chest like a stray cold draft. He drew his hand back, then set it down again, as one touches the rim of a hot glass to see how much heat one can bear. The room kept silence as if it, too, were watching. The wall clock did not run, yet still made a space for a beat. The kitchen refrigerator thrummed steadily. Outside the window, a dry leaf turned in the narrow current between frame and curtain. The smell of old paper and a faint tin tang overrode the scent of coffee, just cooled. He brought the photo closer and saw a thin streak of light on the child's cheek, the sun's bounce on the film, printed exactly where people tend to lay a kiss. That little face used to stand in the bedroom doorway each night, 2 bare feet on the wooden floor, a short, round call in his mouth. That sound had not echoed in this house for a long time. In its place were mail alerts, an inkjet laying black on white, columns of numbers standing straight. The thought of change did not turn into a sentence. It simply sat down beside him, quiet as an old guest who knows how to pour his own water. Walter set the photo on the cabinet top, his palm hovering over it as if to shield it from dew. He turned a few more, then returned to the one with the red cap. There are days when memory is like wet sand heavy in the hand when lifted, shattering as it falls. He drew a long breath, lengthening the measure of it until the jab thinned like the sound of rain retreating off the eave. He carefully wiped the photo's edge with the hem of his shirt, smoothed the curled corner as one might smooth the hair of a child just back from a run, unconcerned with the result, wanting only the gesture. Then he stacked the others and put them back in the tin, paper whispering against paper, thin as spinning thread. The photo with the red cap he did not put away. He left it on its own, propped against the tin's edge, half in, half out, like a door ajar. When he closed the lid, the hinge sounded softly. Walter set the tin back in the drawer, but kept the photo in his hand. He rose, walked slowly across the room to the table by the window. Noon light slanted through the blinds into broken bands and came to rest right on the small face in the picture. He considered a moment, then leaned the photo against the lamp base, beside the soft-back notebook, not to display it and not to hide it, only so that, passing by, his eyes could touch it for a second enough to know that once a time had come through here on small feet, and with that brief call, he slid the drawer shut. Wood on wood made a soft thock. His hand still trembled, a little not from age, but because an old wound had just been pressed in the right spot. In the room's warm gold, the photo kept the red of the cap in silence, a small, stubborn dot on a life's surface, worn smooth. There the father was still bent, carrying his child across the grass, his steps still balanced. Here he straightened, drew a long breath, and let his heart find its right tempo after memory had tugged it half a step off. Walter picked up his phone. The screen lit up, reflecting a faint streak of the ceiling. He tapped the messages icon and typed slowly. Kev. The dash stood there like a small needle. He deleted it. He typed again. Dad, and deleted that too. The cursor blinked in the empty field, like a breath pushed out that couldn't find words. He switched to email, opened an old draft with an unsent subject line. About the wedding. The cursor sat at the end of a sentence not yet complete. Walter set his finger on the delete key, held it for a second, then swiped it all away. The screen returned to quiet white. He set the phone face down. The kitchen deepened by half a tone of stillness. Walter pulled his chair in and opened the drawer with the cardstock and jute twine. The morning's card still lay in the middle of the table, the black ink dry. He read it again, then folded it carefully and set it aside. Beneath the stack were a few cream cards, their edges unevenly cut. He chose another, took up the fountain pen, and without a long message, copied a single line, shorter, neat as one breath. For your day, then stopped, no signature. On the lower half, he left it blank, as if leaving room for something that could arrive on its own without being forced to have a name. On the windowsill, the vase of white daisies held two sturdy blooms, one with petals fallen. Walter took a small-nosed pair of scissors, cut the shortest stem on a slanting, and dabbed the bead of water with tissue. He spread a thin sheet of wax paper, laid the stem at an angle, and clipped the card to its side, the way you'd clip a note to a page. The daisy's cool, clean scent brushed lightly against the smells of wood and the metal trace of the pen. He pulled from under the cabinet a small brown cardboard box with a square lid, the kind bought with the bundle of jute the previous Christmas. He lined the bottom with an old newspaper folded in half, the print turned inward. On that layer, the card and the flower stem wrapped in wax paper. Walter checked the clearance on all four sides, added another thin layer of paper so the contents wouldn't shift. The lid went on flush. Along the side, the seam showed a straight dark line. He went back to the table and took a brown envelope. In the top corner, he affixed a flower stamp, the stamp left from last week's post office run. In the center, he wrote, "To Kevin." The pen stroke was slow, deliberate. The from line was left blank. He smoothed the stamp's edge to set it, then wrapped the box twice with jute twine and tied a single knot, the loose ends angled up like a small branch. Before sealing, he hesitated, opened the lid once more, and laid his hand across to block the draft. He added nothing else. No instruction note, no call me, no phone number. He only nudged the flower stem a millimeter so that, when opened, it wouldn't poke the card's edge. Then he closed it. One motion, decisive yet gentle. On the table, the Love You Dad postcard from that summer camp still leaned against the lamp base. Walter glanced over. He reached out, did not touch the words, only brushed a tiny speck of dust from the photo's edge. The small act was like running two fingers over the name of someone far away, enough to recognize without calling out. He went to the shoe cabinet and set the brown box on the top shelf, the place where he usually kept things to take when going out. Beside it were the laundered knit cap and the worn gloves. Below, the gap remained open, a space once reserved for another pair of shoes that was no longer there. Walter looked at the gap for a second, then gave the jute a light tug so the knot sat centered, not askew. The phone buzzed once. He didn't hurry to check it. Walter returned to the sink, rinsed the cup, and hung the hand towel on its hook. The water fell in a thin thread, catching the kitchen light. He wiped the tabletop with a cloth, circles widening from the center, filling in the speckled damp patches. Those familiar movements gathered the room, still as a windless lake. At last he picked up the phone and woke the screen. The email icon showed two new messages: final reminder and vendor cutoff. Walter left them. No reply, no deletion. His finger swiped to dismiss the alerts. The screen dimmed, giving back the ceiling's reflection. He set the phone down. Its black back threw back a thin line of light from the porch. At the table by the window, he opened the soft-backed notebook and wrote a small line at the page's margin. Brown box, post office, afternoon. The script was even, sparse, with room to breathe between words. He closed the notebook, slid the pen into the spine, squared the stack of papers. A strand of wind slipped through the door crack. The curtain trembled so lightly that the band of sun on the tabletop rippled with it. Walter put on his coat, then paused at the door. He turned back and surveyed the kitchen the way a craftsman does before leaving the shop floor. The sink dry, the towel straight, the table free of paper flecks. The brown box sat on the shoe shelf, waiting for the post office to open. He carried with him no expectation that had to arrive, only a small parcel, a single flower, an unsigned line set into the world like laying a smooth stone on a riverbed. The water would choose its own way. He turned the latch and heard a soft click. On the porch, the noon air smelled of rusty iron and a touch of pale sun. Walter pulled his collar up a notch. He stepped out and drew the door closed, leaving the kitchen behind. Not to answer, that was his way of refusing to turn his heart into a bargaining table. But not to give up, that was why a small bouquet waited on the shelf, under the jute, in the quiet, for him to carry out this afternoon. Kevin sat at the dining table, laptop open under warm overhead light. On the screen was the familiar spreadsheet: florist, catering, music, venue, photographer. In the budget tab, a red column had appeared beside Walter's name: unpaid. The mouse cursor hovered on that cell like a small eye, waiting for orders. Beside the table, a bouquet of white orchids, delivered early to test the light, gave off a faint sweetness, the petals thick and cool as porcelain. He zoomed the sheet in. The total line showed $80,000. The itemized rows ran on: deposit, balance, due date. In the notes cell, he had once typed a very short line: Dad, then deleted it. Now that spot was empty. The cursor blinked, even and steady, like a breath that didn't want to be heard. An email alert popped up in the corner: timeline confirmation. The timing was divided by the minute: who arrived when, who photographed with whom, when to raise glasses. Kevin skimmed, stopping at groom's family. That row had been left blank. He dragged the mouse, intending to gray it out to match not applicable. His finger faltered. He let go of the mouse and dragged the email window down to a corner. On the desktop, there was a folder called Old Scans. He couldn't remember when he had moved files into it. Kevin clicked. Thumbnails appeared: old tones, white borders. The first was a park scene. A little boy in a red cap riding on the back of a man in a blue shirt, both smiling, the sun catching the photo's edge in a flare. He zoomed in. Small details came clear: the tiny hand gripping the collar, a crease pressed into the fabric, the shadow of the red cap falling across the father's nape. A feeling like reading a familiar line sprang up somewhere inside him. The warm metallic smell of the old thermos, the drift of coffee steam threading across the porch steps on winter mornings. He hit Esc. The image shrank, tucking into the screen's corner like a door just closed. The cursor snapped back to the spreadsheet, straight to unpaid. Kevin set his hand on the trackpad and moved to the send reminder button. One beat, then he stopped. His fingertips lifted and came down on the tabletop, gliding over the fine grain of the new wood. At the edge, a very thin scratch showed under the light, a mark he hadn't noticed before. A faint click-tick of a highlighter came from the fridge. Someone had just crossed off another done item. He stood to get water, opened the fridge, and cold air spilled out. The wedding schedule on the door came into sharp focus. Rehearsal, decor, photos, ceremony. At the bottom, honeymoon, in italics, in a blue square. He touched the paper's edge with his thumbnail and smoothed it flat. When he closed the door, the steel reflected his figure for a second. White t-shirt, chinos, lids heavy from lack of sleep. Nothing unusual except the sense that somewhere in his chest a spot was hollower than the rest. Back at the table, he opened the registry. The gifts marked "Purchased" ran in a long line: espresso machine, copper cookware, cast iron skillet, bed linen. In the corner, a pale heart icon with "Thanks, Aunt L." He scrolled to the bottom where cash funds sat. The number ticked up steadily. He tried to picture where a different kind of contribution would go. He couldn't find a suitable place for someone who had been cut from the guest list. Even if there was one, how would that name display beneath the signature with Love, Victoria, and Kevin? The phone buzzed softly, a message from the groomsmen group. They'd sent a photo of a bottle of liquor and a set of cufflinks. Kevin tapped a thumbs-up emoji, then set the phone face down. He reviewed the vendor cutoff email standard phrases: to ensure quality of service, payment by the deadline, everything as reasonable as a concrete road, flat, allowing no glance back. He pulled up the old scans folder again. The red cap photo was waiting, as if it knew he would return. At the corner, the paper's edge was slightly frayed. On the child's cheek lay a thin streak of light, a tiny mark, exactly where people tend to place a kiss. Kevin zoomed in farther until the film grain rose like sand. He exhaled and zoomed out. The cursor drifted to the trash icon, tapped it, then sprang away at once, like a hand set on a hot pot by mistake. He dragged the photo aside, not deleted, not pinned to the screen. In the guest list tab, Walter's name was still there, in a different font from the rest due to the import error from the first time. He corrected it for consistency. Slim black letters appeared aligned, easier on the eye, but not gone for that. On the kitchen island, the bouquet of white orchids stood steady thick petals, clear water in the vase. One petal fell, slid across the stone, and came to rest in a band of light from the window. Kevin picked it up and dropped it into the lidded trash. He washed his hands, opened the tap just enough to keep the water from splashing. Water slipped through his fingers, cold. He thought of some far-off afternoon. A larger hand laid over the back of his, showing him how to tie a shoelace. No words, just a knot drawn tight. Kevin returned to his chair. He slid the cursor to send reminder again. Didn't click. He opened a note and typed balance, then deleted it. Started a new line. Note to self, don't complicate. Deleted that too. In the end, he only narrowed the unpaid column a little, so it would glare less on the screen. The guilt didn't lessen. It merely receded inward, like a background hum, smaller but more persistent. Outside, the late light had changed tone. The backyard string lights came on early, the shadow of eucalyptus leaves printed onto the table. Kevin closed the laptop. The lid came down with a soft click. On the metal surface, his face reflected, warped. He set his hand on it for a second, as if to let something settle. The lists, the costs, the schedule, everything remained where it had been. Walter's name hadn't disappeared. Kevin hadn't done anything. He sent no reminder, and he didn't gray out the blank groom's family row. He left everything hanging there in midair, because one part of him hadn't found what to call it yet, and another was afraid that once it had the right name, he would have to look at it. Afternoon slackened into a thin layer of sunlight on the porch. Walter had just finished writing a line in his soft-backed notebook when there was a knock at the door. 3 short, even beats. He opened it. Ruth Ramirez stood there, arms around a tray of cornbread wrapped in foil, the heat still breathing through the glittering creases. She wore a moss-green knit cap, a few gray strands falling loose around her ears. Her wedding ring, worn thin, etched a gray band on her slender finger. "Made too much," she said, by way of explanation instead of hello. Walter stepped aside for her to enter. At the kitchen table, he spread the faded placemat and set the tray down. The rustle of foil sounded like wind touching dry leaves. He fetched the serrated knife, the green-rimmed plate, and 2 silver forks already tarnished. When the foil was peeled back, the smell of cornmeal and baked butter rose up warm, a little rich drawing the kitchen air closer. The edges were browned, the top yellow with a few dark speckles where the heat had hit hard. The middle was still moist, and here and there the sweet kernels showed like specks of sun caught and kept. They sat facing each other and cut a piece apiece. Walter set a small jar of honey at the corner of the table, but neither of them opened it. Each slice was enough that the hand didn't slacken, and not so heavy it weighed the plate. Ruth ate slowly, breaking the crust into small bits and gathering them to one side, as if gently arranging even the things on the verge of falling apart. Walter tapped the surface with the back of his fork to test the moisture. The fork picked up a little yellow crumb and he set it down, switched hands so as not to crumble more. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed softly. Wind through the window crack shivered a strip of curtain. From far off, the abandoned tracks gave a faint metal touch, perhaps the lid of an empty tin rolling somewhere in the wind. Every sound was small, as if afraid to break something thin hanging between the two of them. She looked up, her eyes coming to rest on the wall where the stopped clock hung. "You still keep that broken wall clock?" Walter glanced over, the corner of his mouth twitching like a new crease. "Yeah. Each day it's still right twice. That's enough." The answer settled on the table like an empty bowl silent, yet with a place to set the spoon. Ruth nodded very lightly, asked nothing more. She touched a finger to the wooden tabletop, traced a bright line of dust, and halted, as if afraid to shift the room's breathing off its path. On her wrist, a fiber from the cap had caught a grain of cornmeal. She didn't brush it off. Walter poured warm water into 2 white porcelain cups, without inviting, without summoning by words. Steam gathered and drifted, like a sigh that needed no translation. Ruth lifted the cup to her lips, only touched them to it, set it down, and turned the handle back to the left, an old habit of a left-handed person. Walter opened a small butter tub, shaved off a thin slice with the tip of the knife, and set it on the rim of her plate without saying please, as if the gestures themselves knew the way. After a while, she stood and walked the kitchen like a visitor to a familiar exhibition. Towel hook set straight, sink dry, orchid on the windowsill. She reached out, not touching the leaves, only bringing her hand close and drawing it back again, as if taking the temperature of a living thing. The slant of evening cut her shadow and the plants in 2, leaving on the floor 2 pieces of dark and light fitted tightly together. She returned to the table, cut another small piece, and set it on Walter's plate, half pressing, half sharing. He didn't refuse. They ate a bit more, each adjusting their breath to the rate of crumbs falling. The brown edge bits gathered into a small cloud on the placemat. She scooped them together with her fingertips into a little mound and left it there. Outside, the light shifted, less yellow now, leaning toward a soft gray. Ruth tugged down her sweater sleeve and looked out the window the way one looks toward a meeting place once missed. There was no long story, no one dressed up the silence. Only small motions clearing a path. He folded the foil edges back tight. She laid the fork in the center of the plate with the tines up, as a way of saying, finished. When she stood, she drew the tray close and carefully folded the foil into a new lid. "Leave it here," she said softly, almost to herself, laying a hand on the tray for a brief beat like a farewell. At the door, she paused half a second and glanced once more at the wall clock. The hands were still, pointing to some random hour. In the evening light, the clock glass caught one last streak. Walter lifted his hand to the door frame, tested the latch's smoothness, and opened. The breeze carried the smell of rusty iron and a trace of warm cornmeal from the kitchen. Ruth stepped onto the porch, tipping up the knit cap a little to look at the sky. No arrangement, no invitation. Just an afternoon with someone stopping by, leaving behind the warmth, the color of corn, and a sentence placed exactly where it belonged. The door closed with a small click. In the kitchen, the tray rested on the placemat, the folded foil reflecting shards of yellow lamplight. Walter took a glass container, cut the remaining cornbread, and stacked the pieces inside, the way you stack the last thoughts that haven't yet found names. He looked up at the clock. The hands were still. He didn't set it. He poured more warm water, sat down, and broke off a bit of brown edge, listening to the faint crack between his fingers. Somewhere in his chest, the words, "That's enough," had just found a place to lie. Not tight, not wide-fitting like a new crease on an old tablecloth. The afternoon had shed much of its gold, leaving a pared-down light in the kitchen. The warm scent of cornmeal still hung in the air, mingling with old wood and the steam from the kettle. Ruth's tray of cornbread sat neatly on the placemat. Beside it, two silver plates lay upside down, their rims facing each other like a pair of closed wings. Walter stood still for a moment, listening as the house returned to its familiar breathing. The steady hum of the refrigerator, the faint swish of the curtain against the frame. Something out by the tracks, rolling once and then lying still. Ruth's sentences rose slowly, like water-printed letters. Her son hadn't come home in a long time. Every time she sent a handwritten letter, I still write his old address, because I haven't changed the lock. Not a piece of advice. Just the way an old person keeps a door from making a sound when someone tries to touch it. The thought moved through Walter, not like lightning, but like a small lamp lit in a dark hallway. Enough to see the way. He packed the remaining cornbread into a glass container. The lid clicked shut. That click made his hand remember something. Walter went to the shoe shelf and pulled open the narrow drawer at the base. In an old tinware, he kept twist ties, paper clips, and stray buttons. There was a thin key, the bow scratched in a few places, the spare for the front door. Since Elena's death, he had taken it out of the flower pot, thinking no one needed to come into the house without knocking. He held the key between two fingers, checked the cut edge, then closed his hand around it as if holding a warm pebble. On his way back to the kitchen, Walter passed the wedding photo. The pressed wood frame held the two of them in a smile that had dried. He paused half a second, looked into no one's eyes, only at the white edge of the dress like a thin streak of chalk. Then he stepped onto the porch. Outside, the day had slipped below the roof across the street, leaving a smooth band of gray. On the step, there was a new damp mark at the edge where yesterday's rain still clung. The orchid pot stood by the door, the glaze chipped at the rim, the soil gone quiet. Walter bent his knees, one hand braced on the pot, the other sliding into the space between its bottom and the wooden floor. Cool dust brushed the back of his hand. He set the key there, turned it so the shank lay parallel to the edge of the wood, so that a hand reaching in would meet it at once. On top, he drew a dry leaf over it, not to hide it, only so the key wouldn't glint under the porch light. He stood, brushed his hands together, and heard the fine dust break apart like salt. The narrow passage between door and porch felt suddenly lighter, as when you pull a nail from a wall without taking the paint with it. Walter tested the latch pulling out, pushing in, to be sure the bolt seated while the knob turned smoothly. Not a squeak. He turned his back and looked down at the step, fixing the key's position in his mind, the way one remembers where a glass is set in the dark. Back inside, he opened the second kitchen drawer, took a pencil, flipped open the soft-back notebook, and added a small line beneath the odds and ends notes. Key, under the orchid pot. His handwriting was even, sparse, leaving room to breathe between the characters. No one else would read it, but writing it down gave the thought a place to live. In Walter's mind, there was no larger plan, no invitation to send along with the key, only a quiet gesture. If one day someone stood at this door, their hand unsure whether to knock or turn away, The threshold wouldn't make them confess anything. There would be something small already there, an answer laid out without words. Night fell completely. He switched on the porch light, and a thin band of gold poured along the orchid pot's rim. Inside, the kitchen kept the sense of cornmeal, warm tea, and wood. Walter poured more water into the kettle not to boil, just to set it on the stove like setting down a waiting thought. He made a round of the house, straightened the photo frame, drew the curtains into even folds, reset the hand towel that was off by a knuckle. Small motions, small orderings, a way to bring a new thought gently into light. Not to lock tight for peace of mind, but to open a narrow seam so the chest would feel less heavy. Before going to his room, Walter went back to the door once more, opened it a crack, and looked down at the dark step. He lifted the orchid pot slightly, felt its weight and dampness enough to know the key lay right where it should. He set it down, more gently than he had lifted it. The door closed with a not too loud click. In that click, something was loosened. Not a great hope, only a possibility. At the table by the window, he added a period to the note and closed the notebook. From the quiet kitchen, the new thought shone without glare, a steady light standing behind everything, so that if, one day, footsteps stopped on the porch, the way back would need no permission. At noon, the sky was so clear, the power lines pressed against it like pencil strokes. Walter wore a light coat and walked along the old tracks to the corner bank. The glass door opened with a small ding, and the cool breath of air conditioning washed over his face. Inside, the glossy tile floor reflected passing shoes. A hand sanitizer bottle stood by the door. The teller counter was divided by clear glass panels, each window a quiet slice. He queued behind a young man clutching a stack of tax forms. On the chained pin, a blue plastic pen swayed gently to the rhythm of the door. When it was his turn, Walter set his ID card on the plastic tray. The teller's voice came through the tiny speaker. Paperwork, sign, wait. He nodded, nothing more. The money counter ran steadily, short whirs. A white envelope was pushed through the lower slot. Inside were 3 new $100 bills, the paper slightly thick and cool, the edges stiff like small rulers. A faint mix of paper pulp and printer's ink, at once real and not. Walter opened the envelope right at the counter and touched his index finger to the corner of the first bill. The overhead lights drew out the security thread in a submerged band. He hesitated. 3 slips of paper could ease a patch of red on someone's spreadsheet, but would push everything toward those straight columns of numbers. He folded the envelope, slid it into his leather wallet. The gesture neither quick nor slow, like a silent nod to something decided since morning. Leaving the bank, the sun stood still on the sidewalk. Walter paused in the oak's shade outside the post office and took the envelope out again. He pulled out 1 bill, then tucked it back in. The envelope returned to where it had been, into the wallet pocket beside the small clipped photo of Elena. He stood 1 beat longer, then put the wallet away and walked on. In a corner of the glass door, his reflection mingled with the backlit letters FDIC, a middle-aged man carrying 3 pieces of paper he wouldn't use yet. Back home, the kitchen still held a faint scent of Ruth's cornbread. Walter washed his hands, dried them on the neatly hung cloth, then drew up a chair to the table. He opened the old laptop. The screen brightened slowly, showing a sparse row of icons. He typed into the search bar the florist's name he'd seen on the wedding site, the name in lowercase, that new, tasteful tone. The website opened. A cream background, photographs of hand-tied bouquets, white the dominant note, green only a backdrop. Walter chose custom hand-tied, scrolled through the variants, garden roses, ranunculus, lisianthus. In color palette, he clicked white ivory. For size, he stopped at the smallest option. He unchecked the add-ons. No satin ribbon, no embossed card. At the bottom was the card message field. He typed a line, the keystrokes sounding softly in the empty kitchen. Something simple. From someone who once tied your shoes. He reread it, deleted an extra space, left it without a name. In delivery details, he entered the venue address he'd seen in the email sent to others, with the window ceremony setup. He chose Note to Florist. 2 white stems only, no filler. The cursor blinked for a moment. He added, hand-tied, no ribbon color, then stopped, no long explanation. In the contact section, he put his phone number, no email attached. Before clicking place order, Walter took the bank envelope from his wallet. He opened it, looked at the $300 bills lying parallel, then pushed the envelope deeper into the wallet. His hands still smelled of soap and a trace of old butter. He set the wallet aside, moved the cursor to the payment button. The amount in the top right corner was much smaller than the numbers he had read this morning, but no lighter in meaning. He confirmed the order. The website showed a spinning circle, then stopped at thank you. He printed the receipt thin paper, gray type. He folded it in half and slipped it into the folder that had once held another sheet. On the table, the soft-backed notebook lay open. He wrote, "Ordered flowers, 2 white stems, deliver before ceremony." The writing was even sparse, each word with a breath of space between. Beneath the line, he added a small dot, like nailing down a thought just anchored. He stepped out onto the porch. The afternoon light was about to change tone. The orchid pot was still there, the soil darker from yesterday morning's watering. Walter touched the rim cool. Wind hissed lightly through the rusty iron fence. He imagined the bouquet traveling along clean streets into a bright wedding hall, resting somewhere among white linens and glass, 2 white stems. No trimmings, no color. If noticed, they would stand like a small pause. If not, they would still be flowers. They bloom, then fade. In the kitchen, the kettle gave a gentle note. Walter went back in and poured hot water over a chrysanthemum tea bag. He set the cup on a wooden coaster and slid it toward the table's edge, leaving in the center the space where the card had lain this morning. The $300 bills were still in the wallet, not gone, only unused. The bouquet now had a path. He was not buying anything back. He was sending a gesture sufficient to its purpose. Before shutting the laptop, Walter reopened the order pitch and looked again at message on card. The words appeared exactly as he had typed them. He didn't change them. He closed the machine. The lid dropped with a soft click. In the kitchen corner, one strip of brown crust remained on the tray. He broke it in two, nibbled a piece, heard it crack softly in his mouth. The sweet taste of corn receded, leaving the fine, clean feeling of a decision just set in its proper place. Evening settled slowly. The porch light came on, gold. On the shoe shelf, yesterday's brown box was gone. In its place, a folded knit cap and a worn pair of gloves. Walter put on his coat and stood at the door for a brief moment, like a craftsman after clearing his bench. There was nothing much to show, nothing to explain. Only 2 flowers would go in his stead, carrying a line that needed no reply. Left behind on the table, the notebook closed flush with its cover, holding steady a day that had shifted a little toward the light. On the wedding afternoon, the phone buzzed twice on the table. One automated email, one link, live stream is starting. Walter glanced at the black screen reflecting the window frame, then flipped the phone face down. He didn't open it. The kitchen returned to its familiar breathing, the steady hum of the refrigerator, the kettle gone cold and stiff. On the shelf, the soft-backed notebook lay open, a pencil clipped between 2 pages of notes about the orchid pot and the door hinge. He went into the hallway and lifted the old lawnmower, leaning against the wall. The moss-green body was blotched with flaking paint, the plastic handle already rough. Walter pushed it out to the backyard. Thin sunlight fell across the wooden step, drawing a straight band of light to the edge of the grass. The yard was small, the grass frugal, no need to cut, but he brought the mower out anyway, set it on its side atop an old piece of cardboard, and pulled on the worn cloth gloves. Turning the first bolt, the sound of metal scraping metal came faint and dry. He used a stiff bristle brush to sweep away the caked mud and grass around the hub. Clumps fell off and tapped the cardboard with small sounds. The blade came into view, dull, coated with a thin scale. Walter took a cloth and wiped in a clockwise motion, changing the angle of his hand every few turns so as not to create a wear line. The smells of iron, old grass, and light oil mixed together, clean but rough. The phone buzzed again, longer this time, like someone outside holding the bell. Walter didn't turn back. He continued removing the guard, set the screws into a plastic lid used as a makeshift tray. arranging them in a circle so he wouldn't mix them up when reassembling. A black ant crossed the cardboard, followed the edge of a pooled drop of oil, changed course slowly, then slipped into a crack in the step's wood. He touched a drop of machine oil to the brush tip and drew a thin line along the shaft. The metal brightened a notch, quiet. Overhead, a cloud passed across the sun. The cast of the shadows shifted. Walter sat back on the lip of the step, resting against the door frame. The breeze stirred the indoor curtain, carrying the scent of cornmeal still caught somewhere in yesterday's placemat. He turned the mower a little more, checked the clearance between blade and housing, and slid a thin steel feeler gauge through. None of it was urgent, but once done, the yard seemed to straighten. Sparrows clicked against each other beyond the fence. From the neighbor's house drifted someone's background music, far and faint, a violin line thin as thread. Walter took off his gloves and stood to wash his hands at the leaky spigot, opening it only until a slender thread of water ran. The oil streak slipped off his knuckles, leaving dark tan skin with clean, bright lines. He shut the tap and wrapped one more loop of tape around the threads. The last drop fell more slowly. Back inside, he passed the table where the phone still lay face down. He put it in the top drawer and pushed gently until he heard a soft click. No need to turn off notifications. It only needed not to sit in the middle of the kitchen like an open eye. Walter poured water into a glass, set it by the windowsill, then went back out to the yard with a fresh dry cloth. He reattached the guard, tightened the screws in a crisscross pattern, each stopping at the right feel, no overdoing. He gave it a final wipe with the dry cloth, touching even the places people rarely notice. The inside corner of the handle, the underside edge of the switch, the dust trap around the faded brand sticker. He didn't test spin the blade. He just nudged it half a turn by hand and heard a thin whoosh, like a breath cleared through. At the yard's edge, a dry blade of grass stuck in at an angle. Walter plucked it, rolled it between two fingers, and dropped it into the lidded trash. On the porch, the cloth gloves hung on a hook. Water seeped from the cuffs into two parallel drops on the tiles, then stopped. He pulled the mower back into the hallway, wiped the wheels, and stood it upright in its place, handle facing out. The empty gap beside it where another tool had once stood remained. He didn't fill it. In the kitchen, he opened the soft-backed notebook. Under the line, "Ordered flowers, 2 white stems, deliver before ceremony," he added, "mower, cleaned, faucet, more tape, didn't open live." The script was even, sparse, no one would read it, but a line there gave the day a tangible weight that fit in the hand. He slid the pencil into the spine and closed it. The sun had eased, more golden. Walter stood in the doorway, looking at the porch. The yellow bulb hanging from the low wooden ceiling wasn't on. There was still enough light to see dust drifting like fine salt. He touched the orchid pot and turned it a centimeter south so the thin leaves could catch one last stripe of late light. On the shoe shelf, the bank envelope with $300 bills lay still in the wallet, parallel as at the teller's counter. He didn't open it. After a while, he lifted the hand towel, smoothed it flat, and hung it straight. The sink was dry. The tabletop was clean, with only a faint ring where the glass had just sat. He slid the coaster beneath the glass into its proper place and turned it slightly so the grain circled outward. The refrigerator hummed steadily. The wall clock's hands were still. The two hands touched at some random hour, accidentally right one more time that day. Out there, in a bright place with lots of glass, people might be raising their glasses. Here, a lawnmower had been cleaned, a faucet leaked less, an orchid had been turned to the right angle. Some things that don't need to run still ought to be cleaned, like a part of him that still wanted to be in its proper, decent place, even if no one saw. He poured more warm water into the glass and stood a moment at the window, letting what he'd just done settle like light tea sediment. Then he sat at the table, breathed evenly, and felt the house draw itself in just enough, trim, quiet, and sufficient. Night fell softly, like a thin cloth laid over the wooden porch. In the kitchen, the yellow light was on, the refrigerator humming steadily like a familiar ventilator. Walter closed the soft-back notebook, slipped the pencil into the spine. When the phone purred very faintly in the drawer, one beat, then a longer one. He pulled the drawer open. The screen lit up, casting a white streak across his palm. A new email sat on top, bolded. Victoria and Kevin. The subject line, straight and tidy, regarding outstanding balance. He tapped it open. The sentences were compact and cold as ceramic tile. Your delay in payment affected vendor delivery. Disappointed. Below was a patched-in timeline, several boxes in red labeled late. At the end, the familiar paired sign-off, with love, Victoria, and Kevin. Walter read from start to finish without stopping. Short lines, short exhale. He let his finger rest on the phone's edge like a hand placed on a railing before turning away. He didn't reply. He didn't star it. He simply swiped the screen dark, set the phone on the table, and drew his hand back, letting the vibration settle in his bones like background noise that had been switched off. He turned on the kettle. The heating element crackled very softly. On the shelf, the chamomile tea bags lay in a lidless cardboard box. Walter took one, dropped it into a white porcelain cup, tugged the string so the little paper tag rested neatly outside the rim. When the water boiled, he filled the cup halfway. Steam rose and clouded a patch of the window pane. The scent of chamomile was round and clean. Outside, rain felt its way onto the porch roof, tentative at first, then more even-handed. Raindrops ticked on dry wood, and where they met the metal at the gutter's edge turned into a thin chime. Walter cracked the window. The breeze carried in the smell of damp earth and a faint rust from the fence. He drew a chair close and sat facing the glass, both hands around the cup for warmth. The tea string touched the inside of the cup, one end peeking in the water like a small brown leaf. On the sill, the orchid pot was as still as a sleeping animal. At the edge of a leaf, a drop gathered, sagged, then fell, just as the rain thickened. Walter tilted the cup so the surface wobbled, watched the porch light shatter into small bright pieces on the tea. He took the first sip. The warmth made a circuit, touched the place in his throat that had caught that morning, then receded, leaving a thin, easier breath. The phone buzzed again. Another email, part of the same thread. Walter didn't open it. He slid the drawer out, set the phone inside, and pushed until he heard a soft click. His fingers paused on the pull, then let go. The porch rain grew heavier. The wind shifted, and a few drops blew in along the edge of the wooden floor, leaving dark round spots. He nudged the doormat inward, half a handspan, so the water wouldn't reach it. On the opposite wall, the stopped clock still pointed to a random hour. The porch light threw a thin bar across the glass, like a straight hatch line on an old drawing. Walter glanced at it, not to know the time, but to remember that some things at rest still line up twice a day. He set the cup down, slid a wooden coaster underneath to keep another ring from printing on the table. With his other hand, he drew the curtain an inch, just enough to see the opposite roof shedding water into the gutter, like another curtain flowing in parallel. Deep in the alley, a cat slipped past, darkened by the wet stopped under the neighbor's eave, then shook itself lightly. Such small things occurred without anyone recording them. Walter tore the tea tag in half, folded it once, then again, and set it by the coaster. The tea's steam thinned. In his mind, the word disappointed retreated into a single loose letter. Standing somewhere behind the row of objects on the shelf, it didn't disappear. It simply lost the right to set the room's breathing. He inhaled through his nose. Chamomile, damp wood, and rain brushed together, familiar and clean. He stood, went to the door, and opened it a crack. The wooden porch let a little rain in, which fell on the rug's edge and stopped. Walter held his hand out for a moment and let a few drops touch the back of it, cold just enough. He drew his hand in, wiped it on the hem of his sweater, and closed the door with a light pressure so the latch's click blended into the rain. Back in the chair, he sat a while longer, neither composing a reply nor writing another line. In the cup, the pale brown petals turned slowly, like a small school of fish in a shallow pond. In that quiet, he smiled a smile, not toward anyone and not against anyone, only to tell himself he was still here, right by the window, in the smell of rain, with a cup of tea slowly cooling. Out there, someone might be disappointed. Here, a man had kept what he meant to keep, not turning his heart into a place of payment. The rain went on. The porch light held to its gentle yellow, laying a strip of brightness across the step enough that, if someone bent down, they could see the key under the orchid pot. Walter finished the last sip, set the cup on its coaster, his hand still around the rim as if holding a warm beat. No response would be sent tonight. Only the sound of rain on the old porch roof, tapping out a song so familiar it needed no words. Rain made the house go dark faster than usual. Walter rose after a half-cooled cup of tea and pushed the window nearly shut to blunt the edge of the wind. In the kitchen, the yellow light drew the room small out into a warm ring. He opened a drawer and pulled out the thin file folder that had once held that sheet of paper. His fingers paused at the folder's edge, then drew it out. The folded invoice appeared, neat and straight, carrying a faint smell of ink and the cold of paper. The living room had a brick fireplace, its mouth as dark as a dry well. Walter went to one knee, pulled the latch, and checked the draft. In the corner of the firebox, he kept a little dry kindling split thin, a bundle of chopped pine twigs, and a few old Fox newspapers. He shaped the papers into a small nest, tucked in some pine to catch, then set the folded invoice on top like a thin lid. Everything done with a light hand, as if setting a paper bird on a palm. The matchbox lay on the hearth, the sliding lid exposing a row of red tips. Walter drew one out and struck it at an angle along the box. A dry rasp. Flames sprang up, trembling at his fingertip, a thumbnail of gold. He bent low and set the flame to the newspaper's edge. The small tongue bit into the grain, sucked, spread at first slow, like someone learning to breathe, and then more steadily. The smell of old ink and green pine rose clean with a slight bitterness. The invoice caught last. Flame licked along the fold, curling the sheet like a wilting leaf. The bold-faced words, deposit, balance, due upon receipt faded, then slipped into orange red, shrinking to fine black veins. Walter sat back half a handspan, his palms on his knees, watching from the first point to the last as you would follow a thread being drawn from cloth. Not fast, not slow. Exactly the speed of leaving. On the mantel, the pressed wood wedding frame leaned against the wall. In the photo, Elena smiled a little to one side, the dimple in her left cheek like a breath mark. A thin lift of smoke rose, sought the flue, and a speck of ash drifted low, touched the frame's glass edge, and left a gray smear like a fingertip passing. Walter reached out, but didn't wipe it right away. He let it sit there a moment, the way one leaves an unanswered sentence to rest on the table. In the firebox, the popping eased and the sound settled to a low, even tone. The invoice was now only a frail frame of ash, ready to break if he breathed too hard. Walter exhaled through his nose gently. He set a finger to the lip of the brick hearth. The cold roughness pulled him back into the present. Somewhere in his chest, a knot had just been teased smaller, not snapped, but loosened a notch. He lifted Elena's frame from the mantel and wiped the ash streak with the hem of his sweater once, without scrubbing. The glass came clear again, the photo taking on a thin shine from the firelight. Walter set the frame back a half centimeter so any remaining smoke wouldn't reach it. Then he sat again, listening to the tiny crack of wood and to the rain outside shift from quick beads to a loose curtain. Firelight swept evenly over the walls, touched the outline of the faded blue armchair, the stopped clock, and the window left barely ajar. Everything seemed washed in a warmth kept for nights. One must cross with empty hands. Walter leaned, brought his still warm hand from the cup to shade the light, and, through the ramp of his palm, watched the color move from orange to ember. He spoke softly, a voice only for the flames. I can't do much, but perhaps, at least, I didn't leave it behind. The words fell into the firebox, no bounce, no echo. They lay somewhere between two bricks in the layer of ash that had just gone quiet. Not an excuse, only a way to confirm a direction, to step away from the noisy shore and hold on to what warmth could still be held. Walter took the iron tongs and touched the hollowed frame of ash. It collapsed. The ash slumped. A coal flashed and went out like an eye closing. He set the tong tip to a glowing chip, turned it to fit, and shut the stove door to keep the backdraft out. The light kiss of glass on the frame made a small clink that nipped into the sound of rain. He sat a while longer, checked neither the clock nor the phone. On the mantel, the frame stood steady, a plane of glass clearer than the wall around it. In the corner, the orchid caught a little of the fire's light, its thin leaves turning a deeper green. Walter stood, clapped his hands to shake off the fine dust, and ran a worn cloth along the hearth's edge. The smoke smell that clung to his hands stung very lightly, pleasant as the scent of a wool sweater dried beside a stove. He dimmed the lights, leaving only the lamp soft. The room folded in on itself, quiet as a sealed envelope. Walter returned the now empty folder to the drawer and slid it in until a soft thock sounded. Before leaving the room, he put a hand to the frame to square it. Outside, rain kept its beat without a conductor. He walked the hallway, his hands skimming the switches and turning them off room by room, as if closing the day's creases. On the porch, the yellow bulb was set to just enough. Under the orchid pot, the key lay still in the only place someone could find it if they bent down. Walter paused a beat at the door and set his palm to the wood. Warm from the inside, cool from the out, he opened and then drew it closed, the latch's tongue sliding into its groove. Nothing needed taking along. What needed to leave had left. The rest he left to the fire, to the rain. A soft step on the wooden floor, and the house returned to its ordinary breathing. No invoice left to speak in anyone's place. A week later, morning spoke softly with the thud of a mailbox lid dropping, then quiet. On the porch, the air was dry, a light breeze, fine dust drifting like salt. Walter opened the door. On the step sat a small parcel, wrapped in brown paper, clear tape drawn over it twice. No cinder, only a machine-printed address line, straight, blameless. He carried the package into the kitchen and set it on the placemat. The serrated knife scored a line. The tape snapped with a crisp sound. Inside was a pale gray cardboard box, the lid tight, a thin sheet of tissue cradling something flat. He eased the paper back, keeping his fingertips very clean, careful not to leave prints. A small picture frame lay still, light wood, clear glass, metal tabs neatly folded on the back. Walter turned the frame over. The photograph arrived like a short breath. A blurred ground of white fabric, a faint glare along the edge of a banquet table, and at the center precisely a bouquet that was almost not a bouquet at all, just two white stems tied by hand, green stalks bare, no colored ribbon, no filler, nothing wedged between. Light fell on the petals and brought out fine veins, like two whispers set side by side that do not quite touch into words. Walter set the frame on the table, resting it lightly in his palm. Along the glass ran a thin streak of brightness, angled from the kitchen light. He tilted the frame a millimeter so the light would fall right on the petal's surface. The new paper smell from the box rose faintly, mixing with old wood and the last trace of tea in the air. He didn't need to read anything more. In the pane, the answer had already been placed by two white stems holding each other upright. There was no card enclosed, no congratulations, no signature. Inside the box lid, a small line named a photo lab he'd never visited. Walter closed the lid and set it aside. He drew up a chair, laid his hands parallel on the table, and looked once more. In the corner of the picture, the hand tie lay tidy, so fine it nearly disappeared. The petals were thick, clean, nothing superfluous, nothing demanding. He stood and dried the glass with the corner of a cloth one gentle pass. On the narrow wall shelf, between the old wedding photo of himself and Elena and the stopped clock, there was still a gap exactly the width of a hand. Walter stepped on a chair, set the frame there, and stepped back half a pace to check the level. The frame held. The two seats' white stems looked down at the kitchen, at just the height that, when pouring water, you could glance up and see them. He returned to the table and opened the soft-backed notebook. Beneath the line, mower, cleaned, faucet, more tape. Didn't open live, he added a short entry. Parcel, framed photo, 2 stems. When he finished, he put a small dot after the parenthesis, like sealing an ink bottle. No further note. The kitchen kept its quiet. The refrigerator hummed steadily. Outside, wind threading the rusty iron fence made a thin, resonant tone. Walter rose and made a slow circuit. He straightened the curtain so its hem fell true, turned the orchid pot a centimeter toward the frame so the thin leaves would catch the same stripe of light. His hand skimmed the sill, touched a very fine layer of dust, then drew back, as if testing the temperature of a new day. In the drawer, the phone blinked its screen once and went dark. He didn't open it. The photograph on the shelf was enough of an IC. At the stopped clock, the new frame's reflected light made a slender line exactly where the two hands would overlap if they still ran. Walter looked at that line, then turned back to the orchid and set a fingertip on the pot's rim cool and damp. He poured hot water over a chamomile tea bag and set the cup beneath the shelf. Steam rose and fogged half the glass. The two white stems in the picture sank into mist and then emerged again, clear. Walter sipped and set the cup on the wooden coaster. Above, the two stems said nothing. Below, he wrote nothing more. Presence neat, in place, undemanding, was enough to bring a kind of reply that needed no response. Before leaving the kitchen, he looked up at the frame once more. The petal veins still held light. The hand tie sat as a knot taught long ago, neither tight nor loose. Walter dimmed the lights, leaving the porch lamp to cast yellow along the frame's edge. On the shelf, between an old photograph and a stopped clock, the new frame stood like a just enough way of saying, "Understood." He sent no message anywhere. He left that understanding in the house, the way one leaves a key where someone can find it when needed. The next morning, the air was dry and clear as if it had been wiped once. Walter slid the morning paper into the rack by the door, put on a light jacket, and walked to the garden supply shop on the corner. The wind chime on the porch tinkled softly as he pushed the door. On the shelves were bags of soil, spray bottles, and boxes of fertilizer printed with glossy green leaves. He chose the orchid kind, a small, pale box with instructions printed in tiny letters on the back. No need to ask anyone. He paid, received a receipt folded in half, and tucked it into his wallet beside the small clipped photo of Elena. Back home, he poured warm water into the watering can, measured a cap of soluble fertilizer, and stirred with a wooden spoon. A light mineral smell rose clean and wholesome, like the thin lime wash people used to brush on walls long ago. On the wall shelf, the frame with the two white stems stood between the stopped clock and the old wedding photo. The glass of the frame threw a thin streak of light down onto the windowsill, where the orchid pot sat at the edge of the porch. The glazed pot was chipped at one corner, silvered roots hugging the rim, the surface soil a little dry. Walter lifted the pot a half centimeter, just the right weight, then set it down. He tipped the can so the fertilized water fell in a thin thread, circling the crown. The silver roots, touched by water, shifted slowly toward a pale green, like a breathing tube opening. He wiped the dust from the leaves with a soft cloth, stroking along the veins, careful not to nick the thin edges. He bent close, eyes level with the orchid's stem, searching for a small sign he had stopped hoping for over many months. Between two old leaves, right at the crown, a green nub the size of a match head had just sprouted. Not a bud, perhaps only a new root, but the tip was plump, glossy, shining like a young bean. Walter didn't touch it. He only placed his hand nearby to gauge the faint warmth rising from the wet soil. He stepped back and looked again from a distance, to be sure that the green nub wasn't something his eye had invented. Out on the street, the garbage truck rattled by with a short clatter. In the kitchen, the refrigerator hummed steadily. He turned the orchid a centimeter south so the new growth would face the thin strip of sun sliding across the wood. The porch light's cord trembled in the breeze. The yellow bulb was off but left a warm tint at its base. Under the pot, the key lay where it always had. Walter fixed the pot's angle in his mind, then pulled the doormat in by a fraction so water wouldn't soak the edge of the wood. He fetched the soft-backed notebook, opened to a recent page, and beneath the line, "Parcel," framed photo, 2 stems, he wrote, "Orchid, saw new shoot, small." The script was even, sparse. He set a period after small, then laid the pen across the spine. No need to describe more. A green nub was enough to complete the sentence. A warm cup of chamomile tea sat on the wooden coaster below the shelf. Steam fogged half the glass. The 2 stems in the photo sank into a fine mist and then emerged again. Walter looked up, then down at the new nub. The distance between picture and plant was a handspan. Between memory and life, a small step had just been taken. He sat on the porch step, back against the jamb, the cup resting in his palm. Sparrows clicked against each other on the fence, thin as needles. The phone in the drawer lit up and went dark. He didn't open it. The sun strip on the sill shifted slowly, touching the tip of the nub and making it gleam a little more. Walter lifted a finger into the air to measure the nub's length by eye, then lowered his hand and let time do its work. In his head, the phrase understood from yesterday's frame didn't turn into words. It lay like a thin ground layer beneath the smell of wet soil and tea. He tidied the ring of water pooled around the pot, wiped the glazed rim, and squared the saucer beneath it. These small acts wouldn't make the orchid bloom right away. They simply restored order to a corner of the house, enough that a green shoot could have a quiet place to grow. Walter stood longer than usual, keeping his eyes on that tender green until it became a detail of the room rather than a miracle. Before going inside, he closed the notebook and set it beside the frame. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying a faint scent of moss from the old tracks. Walter looked at the orchid once more. Not blooming again yet, but there was a new sign. He didn't name what wasn't clear. He only counted his breath, even, warm, unhurried. Then he said very softly to no one, like a seal pressed on the day's edge, "That's enough, if it stays green." In the end, no one declared winner or loser. What remained was a porchlet in just enough gold, a frame of two white flowers leaning against the wall, and an old orchid pot sprouting a green shoot the size of a match head. Walter did not reclaim the father of the groom seat. He only reclaimed his own breath, refusing to turn kinship into a transaction, putting silence back in the place of silence, fixing what lay within reach, a hinge, a step, a brief note. Then he stepped back from the doorway he had just set straight, letting the rest, the other person, go on his own. If you call that revenge, then it is the gentlest kind of payback. It does not buy closeness, does not accuse anyone, only sets down a sign warm enough and walks away. Kevin may have said nothing today, but one day when he turns on the porch light or touches the frame with the two white stems, he will understand. The green shoot has come up. That is enough to live. A gentle note to you who are reading. If it were you, what small act would you leave at your loved one's door in place of an argument? Write one short line in the form, "I will whiting instead of white," or share your boundary between kindness and buying someone's favor. I will read each line slowly.